So as promised, here we go with our view of Latin American history from 30,000 feet. So I'm going to try to be as broad as I can about the different topics that we're going to cover. First off, we're going to think about Indigenous America pre-1492, the time frame also known as the pre-Columbian era. You can see from this map that was included in Charles Mann's book 1491 that there was quite a bit of diversity in terms of the different groups of people that inhabited the Americas prior to European colonization. This map doesn't even capture the half of it. Within all of these different groups were many other subgroups. The Tawantinsuyu, for example, right here, we know these people as the Incas. This was the Inca Empire, its name for itself. The image that I included here is one of the bridges that dates back to Incan times, at least in terms of its design and structure. It was part of the great set of roadways that the Incas had constructed to connect the various places, communities, and cities in the Andes that were part of their vast empire. Also in South America were other groups, though, like the Tupi-Guarani people. They still inhabit the regions kind of pointed to here in what is today Brazil, Paraguay, and parts of Argentina. They're a very well-known group of people just because of the kind of area that they cover, but they were semi-nomadic. They didn't build an empire in the same way that the Tawantinsuyu, the Incas, did, or in the same way that the Aztecs did. So this line is pointing here, the Aztec Empire marked here as the Triple Alliance. That's because it was when it was an empire, it brought together the Mexica as kind of the lead group within that empire, and then a couple of other large-scale civilizations in central Mexico, including Tlatelolco, that came together politically in order to conquer other smaller groups of people, most of whom spoke Nahua. The image here is not of an Aztec site, but it's instead of an Olmec site. The Olmecs, who created these large-scale heads, they lived to the east, the northeast of the future Aztec Empire, but they're considered the mother culture of the various peoples that followed them in central Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica is the term for Mexico and the Central American isthmus kind of all taken together. I also included this picture here to help us think, along with the image of the Guarani, help us realize that indigenous people are not history. They're not just the past. You know, of course, they were the first peoples. They are referred to in many places as first peoples, or in the United States as Native Americans, or in other places in Latin America as indigenous peoples. But they were the first inhabitants of these lands. They were the first ones to kind of construct their own unique cultures. They had impacts on each other. They traded with each other. Sometimes they were at war with each other. They subjected each other to imperial rule in the case of Tawantinsuyu and the Aztec Empire that I've mentioned. And so again, the kind of main takeaway thinking about indigenous people is their great diversity across the Americas. Estimates vary, but I mean, it's very possible that according to one of those estimates, there were at least 90 million people inhabiting the Americas when Europeans arrived in the late 1400s. Also, this photograph is from 1886, after the capture of Geronimo. He's right here with his band of Chiricahua Apaches. The United States has played a role in subjugating indigenous peoples, just as the Spanish and Portuguese colonial empires and their subsequent nations played a role in either subjecting or integrating indigenous people into their societies in one way or another. So we'll talk about that as we continue forward. Whoops, skipped ahead one. The next time frame to think about is the period of conquest. And so as you can see from the map, it wasn't just the Spanish and the Portuguese, but also the British, the Dutch, and the French, among others, who were kind of staking out on the oceans, trying to find new places, but also new ways of connecting to trade. That was the initial impetus for exploration, is trying to tap into the spice trade that had made Italian merchants very wealthy. They were trading for spices from Southeast Asia, Indonesia, through the Arabian Peninsula and the Mediterranean. So it was the Italians that kind of dominated that until maritime technology developed to the extent that Europeans could venture out into the oceans for long periods of time. Of course, Columbus discovered not a new place that wasn't inhabited, but he did discover, for Europeans at least, that there was a Western Hemisphere, that the Americas actually existed. That was unknown to Europeans prior to that. The Spanish, as they kind of ventured out and continued to explore and figure out what all was in the Americas, many of them, as you can see from this Hudson's expedition, they were looking for a way through the Americas so that they could end up over here and trade with either the Chinese or with the spice traders in Indonesia and other places in Southeast Asia. But the Spanish, though, pretty quickly after they started feeling out the territory, they kind of followed a pattern that they had followed during their own reconquest against Muslim people in the Iberian Peninsula, of conquering, of taking control of large areas of territory and groups of people. Cortés, Hernán Cortés, pictured here in one of the codices, was among the most famous of these conquistadores because he conquered the great city of Tenochtitlan, which is today's Mexico City. That was the capital of the Aztec Empire. This codex image from the codex shows Cortés speaking to Moctezuma, the last of the Aztec emperors, through his interpreter, Malinche, or Malintzin, as she was known, at least among some of her own people. And so, just to emphasize, one of the main things that aided the Spanish and the Portuguese in enacting their conquest was the use of indigenous allies. Malinche was one of these, but aside from interpreters, Cortés also was very adept at dividing and conquering. He figured out who are the people who live under Aztec rule that aren't happy about it. One of those groups was the Tlaxcalans. There were several others as well, but he was able to bring the Tlaxcalans to his side in fighting against Tenochtitlan and the Aztecs, and that was really more than anything else, except maybe the advent of disease, the thing that really enabled the Spanish conquest of these large-scale civilizations by seemingly only a few hundred men, a handful of adventurers, as is often said. If you're interested in learning more about this topic specifically, I recommend Matthew Restall's book, 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest. He goes into a lot more detail about these things. Before we move on, I also want to mention Francisco Pizarro, who followed in Cortez's footsteps and was able to conquer Tawantinsuyu, or the Inca Empire. This image comes from an Inca chronicler after the conquest had taken place, and he shows a picture of Atahualpa, who was the last Incan emperor, meeting Pizarro and one of his priests. So this was, again, one of those big moments that was mythologized, but Pizarro was very ruthless in terms of taking control of the Inca Empire and even threatening to kill Atahualpa and many others, holding them hostage, something that Cortés did as well. So through violence and the use of indigenous allies, that was the way that the Spanish were able to take control of many of these areas. The Portuguese followed a different model. They weren't really concerned, at least initially, I should say, with taking control of territory. They instead wanted to set up trading posts. However, by the mid-1500s, wealthy Portuguese merchants were given what were called captaincies to set up little provinces here on the coast of what became Brazil. And it was kind of like giving a private enterprise, these captains, the ability to colonize on their own. Eventually, the Portuguese government kind of brought that back under their own purview as well. Whoops, there we go. It's not wanting to work. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about colonial administration pretty briefly. As you can see from these maps, there were different ways that the European powers tried to administer their American colonies. They set up what were known as viceroyalties. So there were these large-scale areas. New Spain is, essentially Mexico, today's Mexico in the American Southwest. You can see the other various viceroyalties that were established. Within each of those viceroyalties, and also in Brazil, there were governorships, there were smaller scale levels of administration, and on top of all of this, there were also these things called audiencias. The audiencias were sort of like judicial bodies, but one of the things that the Spanish crown did on purpose was he gave audiencias, governors, and viceroys overlapping jurisdiction, meaning they all did the same jobs, essentially, and so no one had authority over the others. The reason for that is that they had to compete with each other for recognition from the crown in order to guarantee their authority. And that assured the crown, way over there in Madrid, across the Atlantic Ocean, at a time when communication was very slow compared to what it is today especially, it ensured the king that he could maintain authority over these vast reaches of territory and peoples from a very far away distance. It became kind of problematic later on, though, as we'll see. Also, I wanted to talk briefly about the social and racial structures of the colonial era in the Spanish Americas especially. As these cast paintings show, or casta paintings illustrate, people who could claim pure Spanish blood, such as the man depicted here, he's an Español, or a Spaniard, he would claim that they were the people who were at the top of the social hierarchy. They were the ones who had political positions. They were the ones who had the most economic power. But many of them married indigenous women. And so in this case, we see a Spanish man and an indigenous woman, and their son is a mestizo. So this says, from a Spaniard and an Indian comes a mestizo, or is produced a mestizo. These paintings over here, this series of paintings, illustrate all of the various racial combinations that could come about. And they label these things. People had status as being not just mestizo, that was usually a pretty general term, but they might be mulatto. And this was usually a Spaniard who married, this says a morra, but that would be a person of African descent, a woman of African descent. Their offspring would be mulatto. And on and on and on. And you can imagine how confusing and problematic this became. It seems very rigid and very structured. In reality, though, people could kind of overcome their caste status or their racial status by the way they behaved. If they dressed like they were a Spaniard and they had lighter skin, they were able to be merchants. They would use what they had at their disposal to kind of walk themselves up the social hierarchy ladder. So my point is, it wasn't as strict as it seems like it would have been, and people were very creative in thinking about ways they could overcome these things. Also, this is something you might want to do more research on, because I don't have time to get into it at all. People could purchase whiteness, as it was called. You could get something called the gracias al sacar, which would recognize them formally as being white, even if they weren't recognized by their peers as such. For legal status. We also need to talk about the African slave trade. Although Spaniards and Portuguese initially attempted to force indigenous people into laboring for them through structures called encomienda, which was a labor grant of indigenous labor to a certain person, through repartimiento, which was for public works mostly, just the kind of sheer workload placed on indigenous people, and also the pushback from people like Bartolomé de las Casas and other members of the Catholic Church against abuses against indigenous people, meant that African slaves were brought to do most of the hard labor in the Americas. And of course, for the slave traders, This was a very lucrative prospect. Horrific as it is, this is what happened. So from 1650 to 1860, you can see the vast numbers of people who were forcibly taken from their homes, brought across the Atlantic Ocean in a horrific middle passage, and made to perform slave labor. The vast majority ended up in the West Indies, Caribbean, and in Brazil. Only 500,000. I mean, it's still a huge number, and of course it's something that is a defining feature in very problematic ways of U.S. history. But we didn't even have that many African slaves come to the United States by comparison. It was a much stronger prospect in these other places where intense labor was required to harvest things like sugarcane, coffee. Of course, the crop in the United States in the South was cotton. And again, it's all of these very intense agricultural pursuits that kind of drove the slave trade. In Latin America, people of African descent, although they were not treated equally by any stretch of the imagination, they were, after the independence era, at least, brought into society in ways that were not quite the same as what happened in the United States. So we'll get back to that as well. Toward the end of the colonial period, so the late 1700s, the House of Bourbon, so this was a name of a royal family in Spain. Carlos III is the king here, who was one of the members of the House of Bourbon. They realized that because of the just sheer distances, the sheer amount of territory and people that the Spanish Empire encompassed, that they had some problems on their hands. The Spanish Empire was in decline because they had not invested their wealth very wisely. Of course, they had great wealth in silver from the mines of Potosí, and what is today Bogota, or not Bogota, Bolivia. And they also got a lot of silver from central Mexico, from Zacatecas. They didn't reinvest it well, and they fought a lot of religious wars in Europe. So the bottom line by the 1780s was that the empire was in decline. It had a lot of territory, the most ever in some ways, by some measures, in terms of world empires, but they weren't wealthy, they weren't administered well. Carlos III tried to fix this with a series of legislation known as the Bourbon Reforms. This was a set of laws that attempted to streamline the administration coming out of Madrid, and it also wanted to look at situations specifically on the ground, especially in places in frontier areas like New Mexico or down here in the Rio de la Plata, and create new jurisdictions that would allow tighter Spanish authority and control over the people that lived there, and that would allow the empire to turn a profit again at the expense of the colonies, usually. Also, this was a chance for the state to show its authority over the church. Groups like the Jesuits had become extremely powerful, not only religiously, but also economically. This was especially the case in the Rio de la Plata region, where they had missions among the Guarani. They sometimes rivaled the plantations of Spanish encomenderos. Those were people that had those encomienda grants or haciendas. So as part of that, in 1767, Carlos ordered the expulsion of the Jesuits from every place in the Spanish Empire. Again, just to show the authority of the state over the church. And I mention all of these different things because although they seemed to work in many respects, they did start to help the empire once again extract resources from the colonies and turn a profit. They also created a lot of animosities and problems at the same time. A lot of people didn't like that the Jesuits were taken out of their communities. Also, there were a group of people in the Americas who were called criollos. They would fit into that category of Spaniards or españoles, but they were different than Spaniards from Spain, who were called peninsulares or peninsulars. Criollos were people of pure Spanish descent, at least that they claimed. It wasn't always so cut and dry, but they claimed pure Spanish descent, but they had been born in the Americas. Simply by virtue of having been born in Spain, peninsulares had a tighter connection to the king. had more wealth and authority and more political power than the criollos, especially under the Bourbon reforms. And again, this created a conflict between these two groups of people. And it was the criollos who wanted independence from Spain, by and large, by the first decades of the 1800s. This great image here is of one of the final rebellions of the colonial period. This one was led by a man named Tupac Amaru in Peru, in this section of Peru, then called Upper Peru, today's Bolivia, in which he gathered people from the countryside under the banner of being a descendant of the Inca royalty, which was debatable. Scholars still debate that, whether or not he was. Either way, though, he led a very serious challenge to the authority of the Spanish Empire in Peru. And when he was captured, he was very brutally drawn and quartered in a public square in Lima. Another important colonial rebellion that I want to mention came a century earlier, but it was in New Mexico. It was led by Popeye. There's a statue of him that's in the Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. He was a Pueblo spiritual leader from Okeowinge, and he led what was the only successful rebellion against the Spanish authority in the Americas, in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. And I say it that way because even though the Spaniards came back 12 years later and enacted a reconquest, that was the only time a group of indigenous people completely expelled the Spanish conquerors, colonists, from their midst. And that one came here in New Mexico. We also need to think about this guy, Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1808, he conquered Spain. He was going to try to do the same in Portugal, and he actually did, but the Portuguese royal family, with the help of the British, fled from Lisbon and went to reside in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. So they went from the mother country, from Portugal, over to the colony, while Napoleon was in power for not even quite a decade. It was 1808 to about 1814 when he was defeated. That was important, though, because he dethroned this guy. This was the Spanish king Fernando VII, or Ferdinand VII, sometimes anglicized. And he took him away from power. This gave the criollos in Spain, and also, well, not in Spain, I shouldn't say it that way, but it gave the criollos in the Americas an opportunity to use their positions in local governments, in these local government councils called cabildos, to begin the process toward independence. In Spain, there were local government groups called the Cortes in various towns and cities that vowed to rule in the name of Fernando until he came back to power. So they saw Napoleon's rule. He put his brother on the throne. They saw that as the rule of a usurper, and they worked hard to resist the French imposition as they saw it. Throughout the Americas, people did the same, and they took their cues from what was going on in Spain. In Spain, in the city of Cadiz, which is a coastal city, a constitution was drafted in 1812. This was, for the 19th century, a very liberal constitution, meaning it was kind of drafted similarly to the Constitution of the United States. It guaranteed individual liberties and freedoms, freedom of the press, not freedom of religion necessarily in Spain, but freedom to assemble. It also proposed that when the king came back, he would be a constitutional monarch, meaning he would no longer have absolute power, but he would have to rule by the law that was established in that document. These were major changes that were happening while he was not in power in those years between 1808 and 1814. In the Americas then, people in places like Buenos Aires, specifically, but also up here in Caracas, where one of the most famous independence leaders, Simón Bolívar, comes from. They were of Criollo background, so they were these people who were kind of upset that they had been displaced by the Spanish Peninsulares. They started out by taking local power, claiming we're ruling in the name of the king until he's back. However, only within a few years, they began fighting against the Spanish themselves and declaring open independence for their various regions. From Buenos Aires in Argentina, Juan de San Martin, led forces in a famous march across the Andes into Chile, where he defeated Spanish troops there and liberated Chile, depending on your perspective, or subjected it to independence. And then he moved up north through Peru. He had to fight hard to take control of Peru because in Peru, very few people were open to independence. And we'll talk more about that in a second. In Quito, in what is today Ecuador, he met up with Bolivar, who had been leading a charge from Caracas. And the two men met behind closed doors. This painting shows their meeting, although there's no record of what they said to each other. Whatever they did say in that meeting in 1823, San Martin left after that. He turned the whole independence effort over to Bolivar, and he went into retirement back in Argentina. And I think he actually ended up in Europe before he died. So again, it's one of those curious things about Latin American history. But you can see the dates here, by the 1820s and 1830, all of these various areas had declared their independence from Spain and had it recognized by Spain. Bolivar's vision was to create a nation called Gran Colombia that would have included Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. It was a brief reality in the 1820s, but it didn't last because there was a lot of difference in terms of cultural and political backgrounds between Quito, Bogota, and Caracas, and they split into these three different nations. In Mexico, the independence charge was led by a Criollo priest named Father Hidalgo, Miguel Hidalgo. And Hidalgo issued something called the Grito de Dolores, so the Cry of Dolores, from his parish church in the town of Dolores, north of Mexico City, in which he called for the end of bad government and death to the Gachupines, which was a derogatory term for Spaniards. He also held up the banner of the Virgin of Guadalupe in Catholicism in hoping for independence. And he led forces, they were actually peasant forces, against various places around Mexico City. He had the opportunity to attack the capital, ended up turning away, and he was executed when he was captured way up here in what is today Chihuahua. The person who then took up the charge following him was this man who was Father Jose Maria Morelos. Morelos, it's believed, had indigenous and African ancestry. He was truly a mestizo. And although he still wanted to have Catholicism as the main religion of Mexico, of an independent New Spain, he wanted to get rid of the caste system and have real social leveling. So he was talking about a social revolution. Both of these guys really were. The Criollos, who were in charge in Mexico City, didn't like that. This threatened the status quo. It threatened their authority and power. And something similar was going on down in Lima. This is why I mentioned that in Peru, people weren't too keen on independence. It's because they saw it as upending the social and political status quo, removing them from power. When independence did actually come to Peru and Mexico, it was a much more conservative effort. In 1820, the King of Spain, Fernando, decided that he would accept the Constitution of Cadiz and he would be a constitutional monarch. From the perspective of Mexico City and Quito, in Lima, that meant that all of the liberal reforms that they were afraid of, all the social changes that they were afraid of, might just come down the pipeline from Madrid. So they declared independence to prevent that from happening. When all was said and done, though, Latin American nations were on kind of a shaky foundation. There wasn't always a war that destroyed infrastructure and the resources of all of these countries. Sometimes independence came a lot more quietly. So that was only a problem in some places coming into the being of an independent nation. But many of these independence leaders had to take out huge foreign loans from Britain and France, for example. And that meant that there was a lot of political instability coming out of independence. People called caudillos, these were kind of like military strongmen, or warlords, they've often been referred to, took charge of various nations. So these are some examples of typical Latin American caudillos that ruled in the 1820s, 1830s, and in the case of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna here in the 1840s and 50s, you can see his leg this was his wooden leg. He ceremoniously buried his actual leg that he lost in a battle against the French in 1838 in a show of his patriotism and his dedication to the nation. I bring that example up because that was something that caudillos did. They were very hyper-masculine. They were part of the culture of machismo. They would hobnob with the kind of everyday folk. They would give patronage, sometimes, especially in places like Argentina, in the form of giving beef cattle and ranches to their supporters in return for political support. What this meant was that every few years, another caudillo would challenge the guy who was currently in power. There would be a war. There was no clear line of succession. And so there was this kind of messy replacement of presidents in different Latin American countries during the early independence era. Also, by the 1850s, there was a kind of conflict between conservatives and liberals. And I brought this chart into the discussion because the term conservative and liberals meant something very different in 19th century Latin America than they do in our current political context in the United States. So as you can see here, liberals tended to be, we might think of them as conservatives today. They would like things like free markets. They liked the idea of Republican rule, of constitutions, of having kind of government out of things a lot. They wanted some social reforms, but most preferred federalism. And what we mean by federalism is sharing power between a national government and state and local governments that also gives the state and local governments quite a bit of autonomy. They also adhered to the Enlightenment, which was the kind of mode of thought that inspired the American Constitution and many of the early constitutions of Latin American nations, but they were challenged by the conservatives. Usually the conservatives were those folks like the criollos that I mentioned a minute ago, but also church leaders. So the leaders of Mexico's independence were an exception to the rule in that they were both priests. Usually the Catholic Church was part of the conservative movement. They wanted to see the power of the church over not just religion, but also over politics and economics, which it had. That was something the liberals challenged because they wanted to see more of that go to the state. They thought the nation should have more land than the church, for example, and be better able to lend money to people and things like this. The military was also one of these conservative bastions of power. They wanted to keep these things called fueros, which were special legal rights that were granted to clergymen and military men. After a series of wars between conservatives and liberals, and in Mexico, there was also a French intervention. The French came and took over in the 1860s for a brief time. But liberals kind of won out. The conservatives tainted themselves by being a little too allied with European powers that the Americas had just broken with. And so people like Benito Juarez, who we see pictured here, were liberals who rose to power in the mid to late 19th century. And even though, as we kind of just laid out, they were attacking the old status quo, they still looked to Europe as sort of an example of what their nations should become. And so the next phase that we kind of shifted to right here, I called it liberal ascendancy and neo-colonialism, or the idea that we need order and progress, modernization at all costs. Liberals were big fans of this. What this meant was that they were willing to make major concessions in terms of land, tax breaks, to first mostly British companies, and then later, closer to the turn of the 20th century, to US companies, in order to allow for the construction of things like railroads, telegraph wires, bringing in new equipment and industrialization. These were things that many Latin American nations lacked in terms of having the intellectual capital, the know-how, and the actual money, the capital, to do these things. And so again, in order to modernize their nations and be more like Europe and the United States in that regard, they gave control of large swaths of their economies to multinational, what we would call today multinational corporations. So the pictures here. Here are a few examples that I wanted to talk about. Besides just the technology, places like Peru specifically and Chile, also to an extent, were able to sell guano and make a killing. However, they often allowed European companies to be the ones to extract the guano, and guano is seagull excrement, bird excrement in coastal areas, but it was really rich in nitrates and it was used as fertilizer, and so it's something that people wanted around the world. It was marketed and it brought a lot of money into Peru and Chile. But again, British companies principally kind of led the charge in evading taxes, getting tax breaks, I guess I should say, to develop the production of guano. And so far less of the actual proceeds went to enrich the people of Peru than went to enrich the coffers of those British corporations. In Central America, by the late 19th century, companies like United Fruit were gaining a lot of territory for banana and coffee production in the region. And following a similar pattern, they were able to get huge concessions from the governments of these places because they felt like the governments felt like they needed the technology that the American and British corporations could bring in order to harvest these crops at a large scale. We'll return to that in a minute. But modernization brought a lot of changes to everyday folk, especially in rural areas that they didn't like. Sometimes they didn't understand. It was a strange thing to go from having births recorded in the church, in the parish, to having the state control those things and issue you a birth certificate, for example. Those seem mundane to us. Even the issuance of money and having the state control that was something that a lot of people were afraid of, weren't sure how to react to. And then there were several millenarian movements that developed in the late 19th century, meaning these were movements that looked toward either the second coming of Christ, or in the case of the movement in Canudos, right here in Brazil, in the Bahia, toward the possible return of Sebastian, who was a former Portuguese king. So again, these are things that were built on kind of myths, but they were very powerful ideas that were led by charismatic figures like this guy. His name was Antonio Consigliero, or Antonio the Counselor. He was kind of a wandering cleric through the countryside that allowed, or that amassed a large following of people to his brand of folk Catholicism. And he created this new community that was about 30 or 40,000 people in population by the early 1890s. And they said, we're not going to listen to the rule of the state. Brazil itself had just become a republic only a few years earlier. It shifted from being an independent monarchy, which was something unique to Brazil. And so, again, people were like, we're not going to recognize the power of the republic. And the officials down in Rio de Janeiro sent army after army against the people of Canudos. They held them off for a while, but ended up massacring most of them, including Consigliero, by 1897. Something similar happened in northwest Chihuahua at a place called Tomochic. And by way of comparison, and this one was just pointed out to me in one of the classes I'm teaching right now, or someone thought of this, I hadn't necessarily thought of it on my own, was Wounded Knee in the United States in 1890. Similar, sending the power of the government against its people who, from their perspective, they're trying to deal with the negative impacts of modernization on their lives because most of them didn't get rich from this. Most of them were forced into wage labor and didn't make enough money to subsist. And that was kind of the base problem. And so they turned to these other movements that the states of Brazil, Mexico, the United States used military force to put down, and ended up massacring huge sectors of their own populations. Briefly, I just want to mention three important wars of the 19th century that redrew maps in Latin America. The first one, of course, was the US-Mexico War. So these two images here represent the US-Mexico War. This started over a boundary dispute in Texas. Mexico never recognized the independence of Texas, always saw it as a province in rebellion, and so when the United States annexed it, and then claimed that everything along the Rio Grande up to its headwaters, which would have included Albuquerque and Santa Fe, as Texas. And again, that was a claim that Nuevo Mexicanos were very upset to hear that they challenged. But because of this dispute over what constituted Texas and whether or not it could be annexed, a war began. The war raged for a couple of years. The Mexican military and the Mexican people, because of political infighting in central Mexico that I kind of already mentioned, but also because they had been waging wars against people like the Comanches and the Apaches up here in the north for years prior to 1846, they were in no place to fend off the United States. Even though on paper, in some ways, it looked like the Mexican army was actually more professionalized by 1846 than the U.S. Army. But when all was said and done, from the perspective of Mexico, this war was remembered as the War of the North American Invasion, when North Americans came into Mexico and invaded and took almost half of the national territory. In the United States, we kind of don't remember it that much at all. It's just like the boundary was redrawn. This used to be Mexico, as if there was no conquest involved with that. But, again, this is something that had created the modern-day U.S.-Mexico border, and of course, this shows the 1848 border along the Gila River. The Gadsden Purchase happened in 1853 that drew the line like this that makes up, didn't mean to do that, that makes up southern Arizona. So that changed just a little bit then. But again, this was one of those major turning points in North American and Latin American history that meant New Mexico was no longer part of Latin America. In the Paraguayan War, or the War of the Triple Alliance, Paraguay ended up losing a lot of territory to Brazil, Argentina. This was a war that dictator Carlos Solano Lopez kind of got involved in, thinking that Paraguay is in such a great position because an earlier dictator named Dr. Gaspar Francia, he put Paraguay on its kind of own path. It was isolated from other places, and it built its own economy and seemed to be much stronger and much more stable than many of the other post-independence nations. However, Solano Lopez let himself get into this kind of quixotic battle to prevent Brazil from going into Uruguay. When it was all said and done, so many Paraguayan men were enlisted and put into military service that by some estimates, 90% of the male population died in this war that took place between 1864 and 1870. So it was a major loss for Paraguay. It was one of the first wars that we have photographs from. This was the era of the U.S. Civil War as well, which was another of those first wars with photography. But, again, you can see the ways that the map was redrawn. The last war to mention, and there are many others, or several others we could also talk about, but these were some of the key wars, was the War of the Pacific that took place between 1879 and 1883. This was a war fought between Chile, Bolivia, and Peru. From this map, you can see before the war, Bolivia had a connection to the Pacific Ocean. This was part of Bolivia. And this area here is the Atacama Desert. I mean, it's a very dry and unforgiving terrain, but it was a place that was rich in nitrates. It was a place that these British companies I mentioned before had their eyes on. And these three nations got into a war over it, and in the end, Chile won out. Bolivia became landlocked, lost its port, lost its access to those nitrates, and Peru also lost territory. So this is these black lines show the present day boundaries. Chile gained all of that desert area. All right, I know I kept jumping ahead to this one. Around the turn of the 20th century, in response to those processes of modernization that I brought up, that meant that most that most Latin American elites were looking to Europe to provide the know-how and the money and the technology to modernize their nations. In response to that, things like the Mexican Revolution or political reforms that we'll talk about briefly in Uruguay and Argentina, just as a few examples, started changing that calculus a bit. People were thinking, well, wait, we need to have Mexico for the Mexicans. We need to have Uruguay for the Uruguayans, Argentina for the Argentines, and so on. Meaning that we need to get all of these foreign corporations not necessarily completely out of our countries, but they need to pay their taxes. They need to be contributing to our countries so that we can reap the financial benefits of the resources that we have. That's nationalism in a nutshell, at least as it was manifested in the early 20th century. In Mexico, this is a photograph from the Mexican Revolution. This was an attempt to oust the aging dictator Porfirio Diaz, who presided over that order and progress modernization of the late 19th century in Mexico. He was in power from 1876 to 1910, when the revolution, I should say 1911. The revolution began in 1910, but it was a year in before he stepped down. The revolution became a decades-long kind of bloody civil war, in which figures like Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata rose to fame and prominence as leaders of the people, as peasant leaders. However, it was the more seasoned revolutionary generals like Alvaro Obregón from Sonora and Plutarco Elias Calles, who was another Sonoran, that essentially won the revolution and put the state back together in the 1920s. In doing so, though, they got people like Jose Vasconcelos on their side in their administration. He was the first to lead the public education ministry in Mexico after the revolution. And he was a proponent of the idea of la raza cósmica, or the cosmic race. And this was an idea that mestizos were actually the strongest genetically. And I sort of bring this out without much context, but part of that modernization drive and looking to Europe was a trend that scholars have dubbed scientific racism. There was this idea that white ancestry was the most desirable, or at least pure ancestry was the most desirable. Mestizos were somehow genetically deficient. Of course, those are all seen as pseudo-scientific ideas. They have no basis in science. In the late 19th century, though, they were passed off as science. And so it was people like Vasconcelos to challenge that idea. And he said, well, no, mestizos bring together the best of culture, the best human traits, and are actually the strongest people. And in Mexico, we are a mestizo nation. So coming out of the revolution, that idea gained a lot of traction. This was something that it formed in different ways in Uruguay and Argentina, but it's something that also gained some traction there as well in efforts to challenge scientific racism. This handsome gentleman here is Jose Batlle y Ordóñez. He was president in Uruguay for a short stint in the first decade of the 20th century and then again in the 19-teens. Under his leadership, he brought in new reforms that were not only nationalistic, but that also kind of laid the groundwork for a social welfare state. So he was a pre-runner to FDR's New Deal. Before there were things like an 8-hour workday or a 40-hour work week or workman's comp, all of those kinds of things in the United States, Uruguay had them. And this was the work of Batlle. His followers and his platform, I should say, was known as Batllismo. And it worked for a time because Uruguay had a trade surplus. You know, they weren't in debt. Those things shift, though, due to international pressures and especially pressures from nations like the United States and Great Britain that through their modernization tactics are constantly placing Latin American nations in debt. When there was no longer that surplus, some of his programs no longer worked as well. In Argentina, kind of a similar pattern, but under this man here, whose name was Hipólito Yrigoyen. Yrigoyen was spurned by the elites of Argentina because they said he lived in a hovel. He is somewhat like the more recent president of Uruguay, if anyone knows him, Jose Mujica. who lived in poverty and drove a Volkswagen Beetle, things like that. That was Irigoyen, except in the 19 teens in Argentina. But these people, again, were showing that we need to do what we can for the people of our own nations, and instead, I should say, of trying to just cater to Europeans. In the midst of all of this, and I keep alluding to it, we have to think about what is the role of the United States in Latin America. And it was really in the late 1890s that the United States began to be a major player in terms of involvement and intervention in Latin America. Prior to that, for a number of reasons, Americans, whether the government or private individuals, weren't able to do so in any major way. With the Spanish-American War, however, where Teddy Roosevelt gained his notoriety leading the charge up San Juan Hill, the Rough Riders, that began to change. It was through that war that the United States held Cuba not as a colony, but as a protectorate. It was kind of a sticky situation because the war began in 1895 as Cuba's war for its own independence. So there are a couple of places in the Caribbean, Cuba and Puerto Rico, that had not gained their independence from Spain in that earlier era, and they were still fighting for it in the 1890s. So these had been Spanish colonies. The United States, for a variety of kind of murky reasons, got involved with the war, and it became a moment where imperialists kind of won out. There was a debate in the US about whether or not we should be an imperialist nation, meaning should we have colonies outside of the lower 48? The answer was yes. But with Cuba, again, we went in saying that we were going to promote Cuba's independence. And so we couldn't very well just make it into an out-and-out colony. So instead, we placed this thing called the Platt Amendment into the Cuban Constitution that allowed for U.S. interventions whenever we deemed fit, essentially. And that happened, as you can see on the chart, several different times between 1898 and 1933. That's important for understanding the Cuban Revolution, in which Fidel Castro came to power in 1959. By and large, what came of the big stick diplomacy of Theodore Roosevelt, so as a military man and then as president in the early years of the 20th century, his mantra was to speak softly and carry a big stick, meaning we can and should police our backyard, as people like him saw it, the Americas, and we should intervene militarily and economically and otherwise when we need to in order to promote our interests. Those interests in Cuba were sugar plantations, similar in Santo Domingo or the Dominican Republic. Puerto Rico became an out-and-out colony of the United States after the Spanish-American War. In Central America, it was bananas and coffee that were the main drivers. Mexico didn't really have a specific crop that U.S. enterprises were interested in, but instead rail ventures in the north, large-scale mining enterprises were things that American companies were very interested in. Many Americans held land in Mexico, and so they were worried about the revolution. And then after Pancho Villa attacked Columbus, New Mexico, famously in 1916 to 1917, General Pershing led troops to chase Villa down. That was unsuccessful. Pershing went on to much more notoriety during his leadership in World War I in Europe. But again, the point of all of this here is that, and I use the Roosevelts as bookends because Latin Americans remember them very differently. Teddy Roosevelt was a symbol of intervention and kind of bludgeoning Latin American nations into doing what the U.S. wanted. FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, during his four-term presidency in the 1930s and early 1940s, he took a different tack. He said we're going to be good neighbors. He had a good neighbor policy toward Latin America, which didn't always translate to actual practice. So one example I want to give you is that of Nicaragua. Here's the country of Nicaragua. Let me back that up for a second. You can see the various interventions that the United States got involved with there. 1933, when the Marines finally got out of Nicaragua, was when FDR was actually in office. So he was trying to be a good neighbor. However, the Marines occupied Nicaragua to promote the possibility at first of a canal through Nicaragua, which didn't materialize, but instead the U.S. was there to protect railroads and American fruit holdings in that nation. A man named Augusto Sandino led the resistance to the Marines, U.S. Marines, occupying Nicaragua in the 1920s. And as he said here, he said that liberty and sovereignty of the people shouldn't be discussed, but should be defended with a gun in hand. My rough translation, real quick on the fly. But you can imagine how Americans thought of him. The Marines tried to stamp out his insurgency in the countryside, but he led a guerrilla war that was essentially impossible for them to eradicate. Nicaragua is sometimes referred to as the first Vietnam or the first quagmire that the Americans got involved in. Not nearly as long in terms of the time span, but it seemed really long then, and it was a very difficult, unwinnable war. What the United States did as good neighbors, so here we have Roosevelt, and this man here, his name is Anastasio Somoza. Somoza was trained by the U.S.-backed and U.S.-trained National Guard in Nicaragua to fight against Sandino. So Somoza had all the backing of the United States, of the FDR administration, and ultimately he ended up killing Sandino, not just like in a battle, but having him executed, and running the nation as dictator, and then his two sons after him until 1979. So this was 1933 to 1979. Nicaragua was under this dictatorship, very much supported by the United States. Because, as Roosevelt put it, he may be a son of a bitch, but at least he's our son of a bitch. And this was the attitude toward many dictators in Latin America, toward Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, these people who were horrible to their own people. Batista in Cuba, for example, is another of these who were very repressive, but they were friendly to American business interests. They gave low taxes to U.S. enterprises. They gave land concessions. And they supported the U.S. policies in the hemisphere. So this was the reason for American support of those kinds of folks. We'll come back to them in a minute. But there was also this other thing called the Great Depression that was going on in the 1930s. Of course, we know some of the stories of how bad the Depression was in the U.S., but it was a worldwide economic downturn. For the larger nations of Latin America, though, places like Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and even Colombia and Venezuela, the Depression was a chance to put into practice something called ISI, or Import Substitution Industrialization. So the idea here was that rather than import the know-how, the capital, the technology, the stuff I've been talking about, from the United States or Britain and going into debt to those countries or to those companies from those countries and allowing them to have all these concessions because they're dealing with the Depression in their own nations, they're not as involved in ours, and so we will take the initiative to try to industrialize ourselves during this time frame. And so, again, it worked fairly well in these larger nations where there was already some capital in place and some technology in place and things that could be replicated. In smaller nations in Central America, in the Andes, that didn't really gain as much traction. Politically, during the 1930s, a lot of populist leaders came to power. There's a lot of discussion in academic circles about what that even means. What is a populist leader and how powerful was this force in Latin America? But we have figures like Juan Perón and his wife Eva Perón, Evita, in Argentina. We have Getulio Vargas, who was a populist leader in Brazil. We have Jorge Eliezer Gaitan in Colombia, who was an amazing speaker and orator, really rallied up the crowds to support his initiatives and ideas. And this man, Lázaro Cárdenas, in Mexico. The kind of common thread here, they all had some different ideas and different things they did. For example, Perón tended to play most to urban laborers in supporting their rights to unionize, and trying to kind of curb the powers of the big businesses, or the business owners, company owners, I should say, in Argentina. Whereas in Mexico, Cardenas kind of had to do the opposite. So he had to figure out what is the constituency here that I can appeal to, that is the people that I can support. And we say this in a somewhat cynical way, but these leaders did do things for their people that were extremely important in terms of providing more social mobility and some social equality. Cardenas is most famous, for example, for expropriating the extraction of oil from foreign corporations and placing that under the control of the nation. Of course, the national oil company, Pemex, became corrupt and problematic over the years after that. He expropriated oil in 1938, the huge nationalist and populist move. And that has been changing under the current president of Mexico, Enrique Peña Nieto, who sought to undo that and privatize oil once again, break the monopoly. There are problems kind of on both ends of that scale that I can't go into in detail. This image here is of Getulio Vargas doing the same thing, creating Petrobras, which was the Brazilian national oil company. So again, these people were trying to appeal to sectors of their population that would, they really did support in very tangible ways, but also the idea was they would remain in power politically because they were supporting these people in such tangible ways. So that's one of the problems of populism. Also, when World War II was kind of the main global event going on in the 1940s, it was a little too easy for some of these figures like Vargas and Perón, especially, to take up some authoritarian tendencies in terms of how they were leading their countries and ending a lot of democratic rule. This brings us then to the end of World War II and the Cold War. The Cold War was, of course, this sort of global standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, fighting over which way of life was the most valid, was the best. And when I say way of life, we're really talking about which economic system and which political system was the best. The United States was a democratic republic with a capitalist economy. And you can see that it's time for dinner. Was a let me back that up for a sec. So the United States was a democratic republic with a capitalist economy. The USSR, the Soviet Union, was a socialist state with an authoritarian government, can't really describe it in any other way, and a communist economy. The standoff after the two powers having been very, what's the right way to put it, uneasy allies during World War II, was that they now were in nearly open conflict with one another. It's called the Cold War because there were no actual engagements with missiles and guns between the Soviet Union and the United States. However, there were many proxy wars, such as the Vietnam War, I should say, in which Cold War issues were fought out, but in these other, as they were thought of then, third world nations. So that was a longer background to help us understand, though, how the United States was looking at Latin America between 1945 and the 1980s. Essentially, the idea was we can have no communist governance anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, and we'll do everything we possibly can to stop it. That meant, and we'll talk about the Guatemalan case in far more detail in a future slideshow, but that meant that in Guatemala, the CIA covertly overthrew a democratically elected president who had risen to power and brought democracy for the first time ever to Guatemala in 1944. The coup came in 1954 because President Arbenz here, and as you can see from the sign, he was big into land reform and taking the tax breaks away from United Fruit Company, taking lands away that lay fallow from the United Fruit Company and giving those back to Guatemalan farmers, campesinos, so that they could have their own lands and their own livelihoods. This photograph is from the Cuban Revolution, which was victorious in 1959, much to the chagrin of the Eisenhower administration and then the Kennedy administration, trying to figure out how to stamp out a communist regime that had just come to power in Havana. But the whole reason that Castro led this movement was because of a US-backed brutal dictator named Fulgencio Batista. Also, famously, Che Guevara, who was an Argentine doctor by training, he had actually been in Guatemala when the CIA coup took place. He wasn't a major player in it, but he saw what happened, and so he was able to kind of recognize the attempts of the United States to thwart the Cuban Revolution at places like the Bay of Pigs, for example. In Chile, Salvador Allende was a Marxist who was democratically elected in 1970 to be the president of Chile. The Nixon administration, super upset about that, couldn't even fathom the notion that a Marxist or a communist could come to power through democratic means. And so the Nixon administration worked hard to, as they put it, make the Chilean economy scream. So they put a lot of sanctions on Chile, and in the end ended up supporting Augusto Pinochet, who was a Chilean military man, in a coup against Salvador Allende. Allende died. This is the attack on the National Palace on September 11th, 1973, in that coup, which is now referred to as the other September 11th by many. But in the end, long story short, Allende either took his own life or was killed. There's a vigorous debate about that. And Pinochet came to power in a ruthless right-wing dictatorship in which thousands of people were disappeared. If you watch, or if you listen to, I should say, one of the most recent Radio Ambulante podcast episodes, they talk about the game, the FIFA World Cup qualifying match between the Soviet Union and Chile that was supposed to have been played in the Chilean national soccer arena in Santiago. That was a place that Pinochet's army had turned into a concentration camp and a torture camp, essentially. And that's been proven since that time. And that was something that the Soviets were claiming. The Pinochet regime actually hid that pretty well. So you can listen to that and get more out of it. But, again, so what we're seeing here is the United States thwarting democratically elected leaders who might sort of trend towards socialism or are openly socialist in order to put in place people who are horribly ruthless and brutal to their own people, extremely violent, commit human rights abuses, but they're not communist and they're friendly to U.S. interests. The last of these, hearkening back to Sandino in Nicaragua, since I brought him up, was the Sandinistas of the 1970s and 1980s. They ended up unseating the Somoza family, and their group came to power in the 80s. This was Daniel Noriega, who was the president of Nicaragua, one of the Sandinistas that came to power then. Ronald Reagan put a lot of time and effort into supplying the Contras. They were the military figures who had been ousted from the Somoza regime, who were trying to defeat the Sandinistas and take back control of Nicaragua. So kind of messy, horrible situation in which people in these living in these places under military dictatorship were tortured and disappeared. Brazil was one of these places. Argentina was also one of these places under military rule. And I wanted to show this slide because in 1985, Cardinal Arns and Father Jamie Wright, who was an American Protestant who was serving in Brazil, they were able to clandestinely gain access to the Brazilian regime's records of torture. So this was something similar to that archive that has been unearthed in Guatemala in 2005 that shows the police of Guatemala City and their role in state torture. These two found this evidence and they published it in 1985, just as the military dictatorship was handing over power to a civilian regime once again and democracy was coming back. But this has been these kinds of pieces of evidence have been part of long-term efforts to bring reconciliation and truth to these societies that were plagued by governments in which torture was a regular, torture, murder, and disappearance were regular parts of just government functioning. And this is still something that Latin American nations are dealing with today. To kind of wind this up, the 1980s saw the rise of neoliberalism in terms of politics and economics. This meant that this was the new liberalism. We might describe this as being fiscally conservative in today's kind of speak, opening free markets, as they're called, having low taxes, low government intervention. And the United States, under Reagan and under the first Bush and even under Bill Clinton, was pushing for these kinds of policies with Latin America, which would allow, once again, for American companies to make a lot of money in Latin America by exploiting a lot of the resources that are available in these countries. Because of international debt structures, there were Latin American leaders that turned toward neoliberalism in the 80s and early 90s, and that supported these kinds of measures. By the late 90s, though, there was the rise of a challenge to this. People like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, and Rafael Correa in Ecuador were openly socialist, leftist presidents of these countries that said no more neoliberalism. This is putting our people in debt. This is maybe good for whatever international debt cycle, but the Venezuelan people or the Bolivian people or the Ecuadorians are suffering at the hands of this. And because of the wealth of Venezuelan oil in the late 90s and early 2000s, this gained a lot of traction and a lot of support. We're seeing challenges to that now, however. Oops.